Well, I'm going to introduce myself while I set up, so I can do a couple of things at once. I know most of you, and meeting some of you for the first time, which is great. My name is Jay. I'm a professor, associate professor of political science here at Florida State University. So in political science, my PhD is in political science and my master's degree is in political science, but I do a number of things within the discipline, subdisciplines that I specialize in would be American politics. I do a lot on the presidency and elections and Congress and parties and things. I also teach political theory and political philosophy, and I teach some international relations and foreign policy matters as well. We were just talking about American foreign policy in Africa and other things. It's a distinct interest of mine. So let's go here to this. We're going to open up my there. Yes. Here we are. And ready to go. All right. 1203. Yeah, so as I mentioned, American politics is really a specialization of mine as a political scientist. And one of the things I do a lot in American politics, and I've written about this in my research, and this is my favorite class to teach. Alex, we have a student in Presidency right now, is the American presidency. I'm fascinated by the history and development of the American presidency, some of the challenges that face the American president. It's a very, very difficult job. It's a difficult office to understand. And it is really the locus of so much that happens in American politics. It hasn't always been the case, however. Hi, Winnie. No worries. I'm just starting. Okay. You know, the American president being at the center of American politics hasn't always been the case in American history. In fact, in the 19th century, American presidents were kind of glorified administrative clerks. They very often deferred to Congress directly. They allowed Congress to really run the show. Congress was what the center of American politics was, in particular the House of Representatives. This is before the 17th Amendment, when U.S. senators were elected by statewide elections. This is back when U.S. senators were appointed by state legislatures. So the U.S. Senate was kind of, a little bit of a den of corruption and patronage, okay? The House of Representatives was proudly this house of democracy. And was often the center of the action in American politics. That's where the action really was. Like, for example, in antebellum America, debates over slavery, the institution of slavery and the role that it would play in American life. So much of the action was in the House of Representatives. That's when that debate really took off. Presidents at that time were often either apologists of slavery or outright slaveocrats and slave owners themselves, as I will talk about a little bit. And reasons why, rooted in the U.S. Constitution. So now today, ever since really the beginning of the 20th century, a couple of key presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, the bully pulpit, Woodrow Wilson, the rhetorical president, these presidents really do shape a much more public profile of the office and the position of president, and they begin to speak directly to the American people over the heads of Congress. They start to look over Congress, over the rotunda of the Capitol, and try to speak directly to the American people. The State of the Union address is a really good example of this. Our State of the Union addresses now, you've probably seen a couple of State of the Union addresses of presidents, right? And State of the Union addresses now are directly given to the American people. The president looks into the camera and says, you, the American people, invites people to sit up in the balcony that represent some policy initiatives, some positions that they have, right? This person has been dealing with this, I invited them here. And the president is often speaking directly to the people. Yes, Congress is there, but Congress is more like a foil to the president's actions in that State of the Union address. In the 19th century, before the modern presidents, before the persuasive presidency, if you want to call it that, using a word from Richard Neustadt, another political scientist, presidents were very much deferred to Congress. The State of the Union addresses were not public affairs. They were often not even published in newspapers. The president would deliver that address to Congress, and it was that opportunity to set the agenda, to talk about legislative process. It was a more kind of insulated conversation just with congresspersons and the U.S. president. And so that's just one example of the ways that presidents often behaved in the past in a kind of pre-modern context, and how presidents today behave in very different ways. Now, what I want to do with this talk is I want to situate the presidency within our understanding of the Constitution. This is a talk given for Constitution Day, And so I've done this every year that I've been here at Fort Hays. The topic typically changes on Constitution Day. I've done a talk on the Constitution and free speech, on the Constitution and abortion, on the Constitution and privacy, and other things. And I think that the year 2024, with a major presidential election, it's a really good time to do a Constitution Day talk on the way in which the Constitution structures our presidency. What does the Constitution say about our presidency? Not just in Article 2, which deals with executive power, but throughout the document. What are some influences and ways that our foundation, our U.S. Constitution, determines, creates limitations, enumerates power, and largely shapes and structures the office of the presidency and the executive branch, more generally speaking. But I think for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus mostly on the presidency, the office of the presidency. Okay, so how the Constitution shapes our presidency and challenges for the future and looking at it. So a little bit of history here. We got a couple of Georges up on the screen. The executive in the early American Republic, it's important to understand that the founders and the framers, when I say founders, I'm typically talking about the revolutionaries. The framers are those at the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia. The American revolutionaries and the framers themselves, they were deeply worried about the consequences of unchecked executive authority. What executive authority represented to the revolutionaries and the framers was, in their view of looking across the Atlantic at Europe, what executive power, how it was held by Europeans. And it was often the case that the monarchies of Europe created exclusive purview over executive power. That was the power of the kings and queens. That was the power of unchecked absolutism. It was held in the executive branch. Lawmaking powers, yes, they could be controlled by an absolutist monarchy, but it was often delegated to others to determine what laws should be made. Yes, a judiciary, the adjudication of law, was often controlled by an absolutist monarchy, but again, those duties were often delegated to others, like magistrates, judges, who would speak directly to monarchical concerns, but were not facilitated directly by the monarchy, if that makes sense. Whereas executive power was always more at home in absolutism, in the monarchy, in the king and the queen, in the leader of the state, the head of the state, would be considered not only head of government, but the sole locus and central focus of power. So the American revolutionaries were well aware of this dynamic, and they were deeply concerned about what that meant for a new American republic. What kind of executive authority? Now keep in mind, so much of the founding, the American founding and framing, were very new to the world. So many things that they were doing in shaping this Constitution had never been done before. There were clear and substantial departures from the ways, the conventions of European politics and European power at that time. So there were major departures. And when thinking about executive power, the founders and framers had a bit of a puzzle here. What to do with executive power when it was so naturally at home with absolutist authority? Something that they were deeply afraid of and deeply worried about. Many of the emerging anti-federalists would say directly, why are we throwing off an English king just to establish a king of our own? Why get rid of one King George in order to just replace it with another King George, right? And indeed, this was not academic or simply political paranoia or sort of exaggerations or whatever. There were really very genuine concerns at the time that George Washington ought to be a king of the United States of America. There was talk of this. There were proponents of this. He was called His Excellency, His Highness. He was treated as a kind of monarch. There were conversations and questions about an intergenerational leadership and political authority from the Washington family. There were certainly the anti-federalists, and many in America breathed a very heavy sigh of relief knowing that George and Martha had no children. And therefore, there would be no sort of lineage intergenerationally of subsequent presidents of the United States, or whatever we're going to call them. Now, the debate between what to call them in the Constitutional Convention itself was an interesting debate. Many thought that the word president was like, low class, there's presidents of like an automobile club, okay? There's a president of like a Rotary club. Should we really have that be the title and designation of the leader of this new nation, the United States of America? A lot of people at the convention loved the word governor, right? Like, this is a high-minded word, right? We're already using this word to identify chief executives in the state governments, right? And governor, doesn't that sound a lot better, by the way? Like, you know, like that's real, somebody who governs, right? A governor, right? And so in the convention, there were a lot of proponents of calling our new chief executive of the federal government a governor. That didn't win the day, and for a number of interesting reasons. It ultimately settled on President of the United States. However, that was really the beginning of a debate of what to call George Washington, right? John Adams, the vice president, was confused when he was supposed to introduce and run the inauguration, the first inauguration of our president, George Washington this time. This is in New York City, right? Which was the first seat of our federal government. John Adams was, no one had ever done, we'd never done this before. This was the first inauguration, first time you're running the party. And John Adams was confused about what to call this individual right here. Should I call him a highness? Should I call him excellency? You know? And so there was this, all of this reflected the anxieties about executive power and what to do with executive power when we've learned that executive power really is the main arm of absolutist political power in Europe, right? So there's a great danger about what to do. Now, with regards to the Electoral College, I'm not going to go too much into this. I just did a talk last night on the Electoral College. But the Electoral College designing a mechanism for selecting the president kind of reflects some of those anxieties and those concerns. First off, it's important to note that it was largely designed, the Electoral College, by James Madison and James Wilson. And those two individuals were two of the stronger proponents for democracy at the Constitutional Convention. Now pause here for a moment. Typically speaking, conventionally, what you have been taught about the Electoral College is that it was designed by people who distrusted democracy and that wanted to filter on the unchecked passions of the people, if you will, right? That doesn't really align with history that well. The actual designers of the Electoral College were two of the stronger proponents for democracy. Really, at the end of the day, what they were thinking in designing the Electoral College is here's a mechanism that can get us very close to democracy, as close as we can get in terms of agreement of the other delegates of the convention, and as close as we can get considering some of the structural realities of the new American Republic. The main structural reality, one of the most important conversations of the founding, and I'm kind of moving in couple of different directions here, but I promise it'll all come back around. One of the central conversations that were had in the early American Republic and in conversations about the Constitution and then ratifying this document was the size of our republic so large. Is that a problem or is that a blessing? The Anti-Federalists believed it was a problem. The Anti-Federalists, one pseudonymously writing under the name Brutus, published opinion articles in newspapers, and Brutus's argument is, we've read our political theory, read Rousseau, read Montesquieu. Democracies don't work in large republics. They only work in very small republics, like Rousseau's Geneva, a city in Switzerland, isolated from other towns and cities. It can have democracy. Democracy can be located in little tiny principalities in small cities, but once a geographical area is large enough, democracy is not feasible anymore. It doesn't work, right? Because representatives need to be close to the people, they need to be just like the people, and the people need to be like each other. They need to be largely homogenous demographically. That's what democracy that's the only way that democracy will work. Well, James Madison, writing as Publius in these same newspapers in response to Brutus, will form what becomes the basis of one of the great pieces of literature in American history, the Federalist Number 10. And the Federalist Paper Number 10 takes this argument specifically and says, look, actually large republics create a benefit and an advantage. And that advantage is, first of all, it's a chimera to assume that you can have everyone think the same. That we have a population of people that are homogenous, that they're all going to be in the same agreement with one another. That's a myth. You're never going to get that. You're always going to get disagreement. There's always going to be disagreement. I often remind my students, like here in Hays, Kansas, this is a very conservative town. A lot of Republicans in Hays. But I'm sure if you shake a stick around, you'll probably, hit a couple of socialists maybe around here. There's some radical-minded people. Not everyone thinks the same. Even in places where we think there's broad agreement about issues, if we look hard enough, there will be disagreements. This is Madison's first point. There's always going to be disagreements. There will always be factions. there are always going to be interests that are going to get together and try to influence government in one way or another. And so the key here is not to assume that you can eliminate disagreement or factions. The key is to balance factions and to create a system of government that allows a competition of ideas and disallows the monopoly of one interest group sort of taking control of all of government, right? And so that becomes the locus of the Federalist cause for ratifying the Constitution. That this republic, in fact, is very large and very diverse. You've got, German Quakers in Pennsylvania, you've got Puritans in New England, you've got Scotch-Irish in the South, you have slave states, you have free soil states, you have a lot of diversity within America. But it's actually a benefit to the American Republic. If you create a federalist political system, which has a legislative, executive, and judicial branch in the federal government, but in state governments as well, legislative, executive, and judicial, and at the local level, and you have these competing interests, both vertically and horizontally across the branches, making it so that not one interest group can monopolize all the institutions of government, and creating checks and balances where the various individuals who are in government largely compete against one another for good public policy, right? And so representatives shouldn't just be mirrors onto the people. They should be wise and experienced lawmakers, statesmen, who can reflect on what is wise and what is best for the people, even if it's not necessarily popular. And so a lot of these debates about the size of the republic, about the role of representation and what it meant, fit within these anxieties of the presidency and what the founders and framers thought of the president. Going back to our large republic and the Electoral College, and I know it's glitchy and I don't know how to stop it, and I'm sorry about that, and it might be distracting to you. Going back to the size of a large republic, right? One of the things that the Electoral College was designed to do was facilitate the selection of a president in a very, very large country where there's not mass communications, there's not television and internet and radio and things where people can communicate with one another. How is it that somebody can make an informed decision in North Carolina about candidates for the presidency who might be from Maryland and Massachusetts, right? Or how can someone in Massachusetts make an informed decision about whether or not someone's qualified for the presidency who comes from North Carolina or comes from Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. This is where electors come into play. Now, I know today we don't know any of our electors. Maybe Alex knows some electors, right? No? Like, electors are actual people, but we don't really know them, and we don't really care. Like, it's not like they're actually informing us or anything. But in the 18th century and the early 19th century, electors played an important role in informing the public. These were people in the know who could talk to voters about these far-flung national candidates. People who were from Massachusetts, even though we're the elector and the person talking are from North Carolina far away. Say, yeah, I know this individual, I can vouch for them, or these are their policies, et cetera, et cetera. So electors, the Electoral College, sort of filled in that concern and that issue of information barriers in a very large country which didn't have a lot of mass communication. So that was one of the rationales for the Electoral College. We're also often taught that the Electoral College was designed to balance large and small states between each other. But what we see subsequently in presidential tickets is that's not really what's happening. Instead, what becomes clearly apparent is that the Electoral College sought to balance slave soil states and free soil states, not large and small. But the issue of slavery, which was so central to the convention, and something that often was consistently avoided by the delegates, or tiptoed around, right? The Constitution identifies slavery, actually, in three very explicit ways, without using the word slavery and without using the word slave, inserting euphemisms like all other persons, right? But those euphemisms belie the reality, historic reality, which is that the institution of slavery and the role that slavery played in American life was actually central to the debates of the Constitutional Convention. It was a central political issue. It was a political issue that was very inflammatory. It was like the third rail of American politics in the early 19th century. But it was the elephant in the room, and everybody knew it was there, right? It wasn't as though slavery was somehow ancillary to some of the central concerns happening, or even the creation of our Constitution itself, or the role that the president would play in American political life. And I'll get to that here in a moment. So we're often taught that it was created as a check on democracy or balancing large and small states, but actually it was designed by the proponents of democracy, and it was really to balance free soil states and slave states. The Washington administration, the Federalists more generally, they tended to be proponents of an active government and an energetic government that could bind the nation together. There were not conversations at this time about really the size of government, the way that we have conversations today. We have like big government. We don't really have big government proponents, do we? I mean, we have proponents of like social provision programs and government programs and things, but they often don't use the language of big government, right? But we definitely have proponents of a small government, right? Core to what we call modern conservatism. Anyway, at any rate, our discussion often about government and the role it plays in our lives is about big government versus small government. Back then, that didn't really make a lot of sense to them. They weren't talking about the size of government. But what they were talking about was a government that was energetic and active and touched the people directly, as opposed to a government that was more distant and removed from their lives. And there were those who believed that an active and energetic government played a crucial role in the prosperity of the nation and the freedom of individuals even, and the assurances of equality that come with it. And there were also proponents like Thomas Jefferson who believed that the relationship between government and people is almost like a zero-sum game. The power that grows within government is always to the detriment of the freedom of the people. When government grows more powerful, freedom of the people grows less. And when the freedom of the people grow more, government necessarily becomes limited and constrained. Jefferson believed that all the way down in his bones. And so that's kind of the big government, small government debate at this time. It was really cast in this language of, do we want an energetic, active government, or do we want a government that is limited and constrained? Constrained being a word often used by John Locke in Second Treatise of Government. So the Washington administration was on the energetic side. They really did believe, many of the folks in the Washington administration and many of the Federalists believed that state legislatures and state governments were corrupt and craven and self-interested and narrow-minded and parochial. And they needed to sort of like bind this nation together, this new vulnerable nation together, with an active national government. This is one of the reasons why President Washington sat for more portraits than any other president in American history. He was not a vain man. It wasn't because he thought he was good looking. Look at how fashionable I am. That's more Alexander Hamilton, writer of a hit Broadway play. George Washington was not particularly vain, but he sat for so many portraits because he knew his visage, his image, how he carried himself, went a long way toward defining a symbolic vision of what America was itself. He really did believe that. He was a man who didn't speak he wasn't very vocal. He didn't write voluminously like Alexander Hamilton or James Madison. He often, through the way that he carried himself, spoke the words needed. Like a crucial debate within the Constitutional Convention of 1787 over the size of the House of Representatives. Those who wanted more democracy wanted a larger house. Those who wanted typically small states, the smaller states, they wanted more equal representation among the states. They liked the Senate design of 2 senators per state. Those smaller states wanted a smaller house. And there was a real hot debate about the size of the House that raged for actually a couple of weeks. And it wasn't until a definitive moment when they looked to George Washington for some agreement as to the size of the House that he nodded physically. He doesn't even say anything. He just nods at the idea of a larger House. And in fact, they had to change the draft at that point, and the smudge on the parchment paper remains, where they changed the size of the House, and they, at the last moment, went to a larger House that was more democratic. And it was because Washington tipped the scales. But he did so in his characteristically quiet way of sort of carrying himself in a particular way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Article 2's enumerations and limitations of executive power. And maybe this is the moment where I try to fix this definitively. I don't know if it's like record, I bet it is. But if I take it out, maybe, and if I, because I am a child of Nintendo game sets, like if you just blow on it, and then it'll work, right? Turn it on, turn it on, see if that works. Maybe that'll be a little bit better. No. Okay, well, we're just gonna have to deal with that. Article 2, executive branch. So first of all, 4 sections, not very long. Article 1 dealing with legislative power is very long. There's 10 sections to Article 1 dealing with legislative power. There's a lot of detail. In Article 1, legislative branch, on the US Congress, there is a section, for example, Article 1, Section 9, with the powers that Congress cannot do, limitations of Congress, what Congress cannot do. There's nothing like that in Article 2 for the presidency. There are no real limitations, clear express limitations on presidential power in Article 2. In Section 1, it defines what executive power is, it details the Electoral College and eligibility for a president, compensation, oath of office, and it actually has the oath of office right there. Section 2 defines some of those powers of the presidency, but in characteristically vague and ambiguous language, right? The president's commander-in-chief, what does that look like? It has the power to pardon for federal crimes only, to make treaties, appoint ambassadors, just as the Supreme Court and all other offices and fill vacancies of the Senate. So it does give some expressed powers, but those powers feel very clerky and administrative and just kind of like, they got to do these things like filling these offices, et cetera, et cetera. Except for that kind of expansive power of commander-in-chief. What does that look like? Now, what the commander-in-chief does, enumerating in the Constitution, is that it enumerates civilian leadership over the American military. This was unconventional for its time. And to this day, there are many countries in the world that do not have civilian leadership over a military. What does civilian leadership over a military do? What's the rationale for that? What ultimately does it accomplish? Well, core to the rationale of civilian leadership over the military is that strategic questions that military generals must solve and deliberate on are not the political questions. And to muddle political questions and military questions together, to have one, like generals do both of those, is a recipe for disaster. In other words, generals and the military structure, command and control structure of a military must be worried about tactical and strategic decisions of how do we invade a country, how do we occupy a village or a town, how do we engage enemy combatants in this field of battle, in that field of battle, air, land, and sea. They think about those problems and questions. In the US Defense Department, there are like binders and binders of information on how to invade, I don't know, maybe every country in the world. I'm sure there's got information on how to invade Switzerland, which is like not even almost a real country, but you know, I don't think anyone's tried to invade Switzerland for like 1,000 years. But in the Defense Department, there's reams of information and data about all of this military strategy, tactical considerations, and everything else. But the decision of whether or not we should invade a country, whether or not we should occupy a village or town, whether or not we should engage in war with an enemy combatant in whatever environment, those are political questions. And those are questions above and beyond. In fact, civilian leadership over the military is for the military's benefit as well as for the country's benefit. Because you don't want a military saddled with those difficult political questions. You need them to focus on the strategic military questions. Once they are ordered by civilian leadership to occupy a village or a town or invade a country or whatever, then that's when those strategic considerations of military come in play. Those are the things that they really do need to be focused on, okay? So I know it's only a small mention here in Article 2, but that notion of president as a commander-in-chief underscores this very important dynamic that exists between military structure and government civilian leadership that remains to this day. And there are real outcomes to civilian leadership over the military. For example, a study was done 10 years ago or so by a comparativist IR political scientist. A really good study looking at civilian leadership in the military around the world. And he showed pretty conclusively that military juntas, military overthrow of government, become far more common, far more possible when there is not civilian leadership over the military. So there are outcomes that one has to consider when it comes to that dynamic. Washington, I want to also insinuate this very quickly before I get into slavery in the Constitution. Washington was a land surveyor as a profession. That's what he was trained to do. He was a frontiersman. He was a planter in Virginia. Planter meaning like one of the first settlers in what was the wilderness. All of the skills he developed in his life very much were the kinds of things that the framers were thinking of when they were thinking of chief executive in Article 2. They already had the ideal of who the ideal president would be. He was there in the convention. He was sitting in a chair. And it's like actually kind of remarkable to think about. In fact, if we think about this, we're now in our 46th president, onto our 47th president. And doesn't Washington still in many ways remain the ideal of what the American presidency is? In many ways, he kind of still does. It's kind of remarkable that the first president became the ideal, and ever since then has kind of largely remained that ideal in a lot of ways. And it's because the framers of the US Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, when they were thinking about the chief executive, when they were thinking about what ultimately we're going to call the President of the United States, they already had in mind an individual. There was almost unanimous agreement that this individual would ascend to the presidency, would be the first president. And so, in other words, the office was largely constructed with him in mind. Okay, well, I'll move on, but section 3, I just want to remind you, a crucial section here where it's like they have to deliver a State of the Union. The president shall. The first word actually in the first draft was may. The president may deliver a State of the Union. They took out the word may and they put in the word shall, meaning they made it mandatory for presidents to deliver a State of the Union. They had to. It's a responsibility. Another crucial aspect of Section 3 is that a president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And in those short words is the enforcement power and implementation power of the executive branch. Yes?
The president fills vacancies in the Senate? It's not the
president fills vacancies in the Senate. The president confirms vacancies in the Senate only when the senator dies in office and is not elevated to another position. The governor fills vacancies in the Senate when that senator leaves office for another position in government. There's some complications. Good question. There's another hand up over here. Alex, okay. And so, yeah, take care of the laws be faithfully executed. Should I talk about impeachment very much? Maybe not. There's a lot to discuss in impeachment. I'm going to leave that one for now. Okay, so executive in the early American Republic, again, oh, no, I'm sorry. Here we are. There, slavery in the presidency. Okay. So as I mentioned to you before, slavery was really a central issue of debate in the early American Republic. And one of the things that ends up in our US Constitution is the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause radically alters arrangements of power between slave soil and free soil states, invariably tipping the scales toward the slaveocracy and slave power. The 3/5 clause is sometimes called the 3/5 compromise. I don't call it a compromise because it was not a compromise at all. It was really a giveaway to the slave powers of the South. What the 3/5 clause says is that slaves shall be counted as 3/5 persons for apportionment in the House of Representatives, okay? For apportionment in the House. They determine what representation we have in the House of Representatives. It doesn't speak to the Senate because the Senate is 2 per state, equal representation among the states. But when it comes to the House of Representatives, that representation is based on population. The more populous the states, the more seats you get in the House. When counting up the people, which the Constitution calls enumeration, and which we call a census, when you count up all the people, the original Constitution had slaves be counted as 3/5 persons for apportionment in the House. What this did was it gave slave power a tremendous amount of leverage and advantage within the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, how does this relate to the presidency? Well, as you probably well know, the Electoral College, the number of electoral votes that each state has in the Electoral College is determined by its congressional representation. The number of House seats that state has, plus 2 for their senators. So that's what the Electoral College is. For example, Texas has, I believe, 40 electors, or 40 electoral votes. That means that Texas has 38 U.S. House seats, plus 2 senators, that's 40 electoral votes, right? So if slaves are counted as 3/5 persons for apportionment in the House of Representatives, that means that those states that have slavery have an outsized role in determining the president, have an advantage in selecting the president through the Electoral College. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And so this is the reason why, there's no coincidence here, that all of the presidents from Washington up to through James Buchanan, the 15th president, the presidents of our antebellum America before the Civil War, all of them were either apologists of slavery or outright slave owners themselves. Not a single one was an abolitionist. The closest thing to an abolitionist might be John Quincy Adams. But John Quincy Adams as president largely avoided the issue of slavery. He had a one-term presidency, 1825 to 1829. Didn't really accomplish very much either way with regards to slavery. becomes much more an opponent of slavery after the presidency when he goes back to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams, one of the few presidents to have held office in Congress after the presidency, actually was in the House for a very long time. And he became one of the most vocal opponents of slavery, okay? But even then, he would say that classic line, I'm not an abolitionist. Don't get me wrong, I'm not an abolitionist. I just think slavery is an evil, right? Which was a very common thing to say at that time. Now, I repeated myself from the talk I gave yesterday, but it's an important point. The reason why so many people were like, oh, I'm not an abolitionist, I just think slavery is an evil, is because abolitionism was a real radical position at this time. It really was. It was a controversial opinion. And that might be hard for us to accept, but it's the reality, it's the historical reality. If we were in the 1850s right now in this room, we probably would all love for us to think that we would be abolitionists, but the reality is there might be one, maybe two of us in this room out of this group that would truly be considered abolitionists. It was a radical position. It was a controversial position. And so even opponents of slavery like Abraham Lincoln would be quick to say, Lincoln very eloquently said at one time, he said, you know what, if slavery is not evil, then nothing is evil, right? But he also said, I'm not an abolitionist. I'm not an abolitionist, right? And so the presidents of this time were either apologists for slavery or outright slave owners themselves so very often, and a lot of it has to do with the 3/5 clause. The Electoral College, as I say here, is determined by congressional representation of each state. The 3/5 clause gives greater power to slave states in the House of Representatives, thus influencing the selection of the president. Now, the rot of the 3/5 clause doesn't just stop there, because a president appoints Supreme Court justices, fills vacancies, appoints officers, appoints a cabinet, and so being a slave apologist made it more likely that Supreme Court justices would be apologists of slavery, that cabinet members would be apologists of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, it's no coincidence that the Supreme Court becomes more radicalized in a pro-slave position over time. American politics, broadly speaking, becomes more radicalized. We go away from Washington and Jefferson, who were these like gentlemen of civic virtue who owned slaves, but also made uncomfortable acknowledgments that slavery was evil very often. Jefferson actually introduced 5 bills to the Virginia House of Commons to abolish slavery within Virginia. And all of these individuals, from one degree or another, we can debate the nuance involved, but from one degree or another, these were individuals who understood the pernicious nature of slavery, that it was corrupting America, and that they were concerned about it. They had deep concerns about it in many ways, even though they held slaves, even though they were slave owners. These folks largely die and fade into the annals of history by the 1840s and 1850s. And the individuals who replaced them are like the John C. Calhouns and the George Fitzhughs of our world. George Fitzhugh would say slavery is a humane good to America. It's really the industrial factories in the North. Those are the wage slaves up there who toil in factories. They're not guaranteed any housing. They're not guaranteed any food, any subsistence whatsoever. They're slaves to the evil of capitalism, said George Fitzhugh, right? This is like even before Marx. It's like pre-Marxian anti-capitalism from a slavocrat's view, George Fitzhugh. And George Fitzhugh would say, down here in the South, we take care of our slaves. They're given food, water, housing. Slavery is humane. It's a good, right? And so what this says is that the issue of slavery is deeply radicalized in American politics by the 1840s and 1850s. The slavocrats, the only way to destroy slavery in this country is by the end of a gun and the blade of a sword, not peacefully through law. You can't do it through the court system. The courts have been fully corrupted by the slavocrats. The Taney Court, Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rules in the Dred Scott decision that none of the Bill of Rights, anytime the Constitution speaks of persons or people, never referring to black people. That's the decision of Dred Scott, that the Constitution does not speak to at all black Americans, no matter if they were born in freedom, no matter if they are free black. They were not to be protected by the Bill of Rights. The Constitution doesn't speak to them at all. It's a really radical position. That's a hardcore radical position, right? And the Constitution enables it. No antebellum president was an abolitionist. Almost all antebellum presidents were either slave apologists or slave owners themselves. These gentlemen of civic virtue, as I mentioned, like Washington and Madison and Jefferson, slave owners, who tended to look upon slavery with a kind of reluctant acceptance. It's like, yes, I own them, but people have asked me before. Jefferson's a really good example of this. How could it be possible that our third president of the United States wrote the words, "All men are created equal and yet own slaves"? How is that possible? Was he ignorant of this hypocrisy? And from my understanding of Jefferson, and we can debate the nuances, I really don't believe he was ignorant of the hypocrisy. I think that it was something that he was well aware of that really tore at him, that really did create a kind of crisis within him in many ways. Something that was a deep conflict that went deep down into not only who he was as a person, but how he saw the world and what he believed the destiny of America was, the destiny of himself, the destiny of Virginians, et cetera, et cetera. For example, the one thing that constantly haunted Thomas Jefferson in his life, indebtedness. Always in debt. Could never get out of it. Always owed people money. Everywhere. For his whole damn life. In fact, at one point after the presidency, he decided to sell many of his very valuable and precious books that he accumulated. He had one of the world's largest private libraries assembled. And he sold a huge chunk of it. He was going to sell it to private buyers. But the federal government stepped in and said, we'll buy that whole collection. This forms the basis of the U.S. Library of Congress, the largest library in the world today. The original acquisition of the largest library today was Thomas Jefferson's private library. Not all of it, but a good chunk of it, like 80% of it. And that allowed him to pay off a bunch of creditors and get away from debt. But the dude could not stop buying books and other things, and just kept sinking back into indebtedness. And by the end of his life, like, he was deeply into debt. And he lived for a long time. You all know that Jefferson lived like 200 years. He was a vampire or something. And by the time he finally died, the creditors were just like chomping at the bit. Could not wait to get to Monticello, to tear it apart, to sell off the pieces so that they could get their, repayment back for their debts. And so, thinking about this, that Jefferson, his main thing that haunts him is indebtedness. He honestly believed the relationship between indebtedness and freedom was a zero-sum game. If you are in debt, you are not free. Okay? He comes from a world in which that was legally accepted and codified as well. Like, you could go to prison for being in debt, right? And there was this belief that government should never hold debt, right? This is what made Alexander Hamilton so scary to a lot of people. Because Hamilton was like, no, debt's good. We can use debt, have a higher credit rating, issue treasury bills, manage debt. Right? That's economic power. He was right about all that, of course. We live in a very debt-based economic system today. You need debt to have a good credit rating. You need debt to basically do a lot of things in our economy today. Hamilton was largely right about that. Or maybe, his vision is what ultimately became. Yeah.
Sorry. And one of the things I sadly learned about Jefferson is that some of his views were very self-serving. One of which was he advocated a revolution every generation. One of the reasons it seems to be clearly is that all debts would be obliterated. You get to start over fresh.
Yeah.
And
a great point, and that brings it back around to the point I don't know if I articulated well, is that his view of slavery, his relationship to slavery, was often in this complex of what really haunted him was indebtedness. He believed that slaves was a way to get himself out of debt, that it would be a way to make Monticello more productive. He could even sell slaves directly or whatever, but he always had this valuable asset. Most of the money and economic value in the South and antebellum America was tied up into slaves. Slaves were very expensive. Slaves were worth a lot of money. It is not just labor in the lifetime of the slave, it is intergenerational property control over that human being, meaning their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will also indeed be slaves. And so there was, a lot of value in that. And Jefferson, in his self-serving way, viewed slavery and often in that way. So I think one of the things that Jefferson struggled with is that he was clearly aware of the evils of slavery and committed to equality of human beings, but yet it was an opportunity for him to get away from the things that really haunted him, indebtedness. As I already mentioned, Lincoln's position was not unusual for its time. He was no abolitionist. He nonetheless viewed slavery as immoral. As I talked about before, from clerks to statesmen, pre-modern presidents tended to defer to Congress. A very extreme example here is Zach Taylor, who frankly didn't know anything about government. Dude was like completely ignorant of government. He was a military guy. And he even told people, he's like, I actually don't know anything about what we're about to do. And one of his campaign promises, as he was running for the presidency, is anything that Congress passes, any bill that passes, I'll sign into law. Think about a president saying that today. That's like extraordinary. No president would say today, whatever you say, Congress, I'll agree with and I'll sign it into law. You know, and Zach Taylor's whole idea is like, I'm going to defer to the most democratic branch, right? The people elect these House representatives directly. And if they determine that this bill is wise for the people, I defer to them, I will sign it into law, right? In executing the war, Lincoln, yes, he destroys slavery, but he also modernizes the federal government and the American economy. He resolves old political disputes like the question of a national bank or internal improvements. And he shapes the future of government's relationship with the people. And this is crucially what the Gettysburg Address does. I spent a lot of time on the Gettysburg Address in my classes. I deconstruct it in the 3 paragraphs. We talk about its deeper meaning. I do think it's one of the most important transformative moments in American history. That Gettysburg Address, that one afternoon on that battlefield, still soaked with blood, in which Abraham Lincoln changes the reason for the Civil War. The why we were in the Civil War from the North's perspective in the early years was about preserving the Union. But what sense does that make? For a lot of people, to a lot of soldiers fighting in the battlefield, like, what the hell's the Union? I don't care what that is. Especially like, you imagine like Irish immigrants coming right off the boat in New York City, given a uniform and a gun, say, go fight for the Union. These Irish immigrants are like, what's the Union? I just got here, right? So the cause of like preserve the Union was not something that was really creating the kind of motivations of war that would successfully execute that war. We needed a new rationale. And in the Gettysburg Address, in that second paragraph where he talks about now, on this battlefield, right now, what we're going to do is we're going to change the aims of the war. And this war is about ensuring equality of all persons under the law, right? And so that fight for equality, that government's role is to ensure equality, right? This actually, this kind of little turn, which doesn't seem very significant at the time, really forms the foundational basis for what we will call the relationship between government and the people, especially throughout the 20th century. The long march toward equality, our various civil rights movements, right? In which now the federal government has realized an important role in our democratic life, in our political life, which is to uphold and protect the Bill of Rights, to protect our rights, to ensure an equality under the law, equal protection under the law of the 14th Amendment, and to do that work, which is so very important. For example, the Supreme Court, not the presidency, but the Supreme Court, in the 19th century, look at Supreme Court cases. Most of those cases were about contracts, property, a subset of that would be slavery, relationship between the states and federal governments. Those kinds of arrangements and issues were often adjudicated by the Supreme Court. Starting in World War I, maybe a little bit before, I have a book that argues a little bit before in a movie called Birth of a Nation, and Hollywood movies form an important part of this. But World War I definitively, the Supreme Court cases start to really change. And afterward, the Supreme Court begins adjudicating in numerous ways individual rights. The Bill of Rights become part of a question or a contestation about what these things mean and what the role of the government and the people are. For example, our Second Amendment was never really adjudicated in terms of a textual analysis until D.C. v. Heller, which is like 2006. Right? There's a case like U.S. v. Miller in the 30s, but that didn't really take seriously the text of the Second Amendment or advance an argument about the textual meaning of the Second Amendment. Various different elements of our Bill of Rights. It takes a long time for the Supreme Court to really find that to be the center of our political debates. I already talked about Teddy Roosevelt and the bully pulpit, how he changes from being a mere administrative clerk, he changes the office to, again, try to reach the people directly, to be a kind of populist leader. Woodrow Wilson and the rhetorical president, it's actually Woodrow Wilson who begins to speak directly to the public in State of the Union addresses. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I like to call him a populist in the streets and an elitist in the sheets. And you're welcome for that. You're welcome. That's one of my few contributions to intellectual life, is just that phrase. FDR was, in his fireside chats, this intimate voice, right into your home, right into the privacy of your home, speaking to your family, right? He would act like a populist. He'd be like, well, throw the money changers out of the temple, meaning get the bankers out of politics, right? But in fact, in the White House, he worked with those bankers, and he worked with big business, and he worked with big labor as well. And he thought that everyone has a slice of the pie and has an interest that they need to bring to the fore, and that's what a lot of New Deal legislation was. Big patchwork legislation that give little slices of the pie to different groups. America itself, from a sleeping giant to a world power, doesn't this reflect some of the changes and development of the presidency itself? In other words, would the presidency have evolved into something like what Arthur Schlesinger calls the imperial presidency had we not become a global power? Probably not, right? Probably not. That the rise of American global power is also the rise of the presidency. And today, the presidency really does stand preeminent over American political life. We look to the presidency for action, for decisions, for everything that happens that's bad. Who do we blame? The president. Everything that good that's happened, it's probably somebody else, not the president. Yeah, just kidding. But the president is blamed for a lot, right? The expectations are sky high for the president. One of my favorite presidential theories is by a guy named William Howell at the University of Chicago. And he argues that the sky-high expectations of the presidency, we have these outsized expectations. We really do expect the president to solve all of our problems, and we blame them for everything that goes wrong. We add to that the ambiguous set of powers in Article 2 of the Constitution, where it's not very vague, it's not very detailed, it's not very clearly defined. It's very vague what a president does. You put those two things together, and what you get is every single president trying to maximize power, trying to grow power of the presidency. The imperial presidency is what you get, right? You get sky-high expectations with not very clearly defined powers in the Constitution, and every president wants to figure out how to expand the levers of power of the presidency. Even a great example of this is Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a constitutional law scholar. He talked critically about the imperial presidency. He talked about how the growth of the presidency was to a disadvantage to American democracy writ large as an academic. But then when he finds himself actually in the presidency, Obama's trying to figure out how to expand the powers of the presidency like every other president, right? And so there's something about the office which is like, got to grow these powers, got to expand these. And this is where I think we should leave off and maybe have a short discussion or where the point I want to emphasize. We've reached a place now. The Supreme Court has determined this summer that our presidents engaging in presidential actions immune from criminal process, immune from any criminal liability whatsoever. We have full criminal immunity for presidential actions. Is that the kind of presidency we want? Maybe it is, maybe not. But we need to have a conversation about this, and we should see that that Supreme Court decision is actually embedded within a long line of the development of the presidency and the growth of imperial power within the presidency. Have the powers of the presidency outstrip their constitutional limitations? And to the disadvantage of America, do we need more guardrails on power directly and guardrails on the presidency? These are really important questions. I'm not going to give you the answer because it's not my job, but I want to present the question to you. It's an important question to ask. Article 2 is very thin relative to Article 1's federal legislature, as I pointed out already, right? Article 2 has few express powers. Yeah, commander-in-chief, take care of the laws, be faithfully executed, but not much. There's no limitations on power. There's no Article 2, Section 9, like there is Article 1, Section 9, what Congress cannot do. There's nothing in there that says anything about a cabinet, nothing on the vice presidency and what the vice presidency does, which has meant that vice presidents have to try to figure out what to do when they get into office. And there's little structuring of the executive branch. There's just nothing there. And what that does is really enable an imperial presidency, in the words of Arthur Schlesinger, okay? And the point that I want to make here, or the question that I have is does this thin Article 2, does this explain the imperial presidency? Does this explain the tremendous growth of executive power over time? And if so, I think there's an interesting insight in this politically. And that insight is this, that powers that are well defined are more easily contained and circumscribed. They're more easily created a boundary around them and a limitation. Thou shalt go no farther. Okay? But powers that are ambiguously defined, they lack clear guardrails that limit that power. And we should be worried about that, right? And thus enable expansions of power, authority, and capacity. So today, the Supreme Court and the presidency, both Article 2 and Article 3 of the US Constitution, they largely reign supreme over the polarized, slow-moving Congress, where, you know, Congress is barely able to make politics, let alone make law, right? And so does that explain, does our Constitution explain the development historically of these branches in relationship to power and capacity? Well, I think that there's a worthy thing to analyze and reflect on next. So thank you very much for a good talk. Any quick questions or comments? I know I kind of ran about an hour in, so if anyone has any comments or questions, I'd sure like to hear them.
Do you feel as though the Electoral College is now obsolete since it's no longer about slaveholders and?
And information barriers as well. You know, I made
I know
that
you just
point
talked about this last night apparently, but I didn't hear it, so.
Yeah, one of the rationales for the Electoral College is that electors can provide us information about these candidates. We don't really need that right now, do we? I mean, like, we have the internet. We have national candidates it's easy to figure out who they are and what their positions are, et cetera, et cetera. Have we outstripped the kind of parochial structures of the Electoral College? Again, a really, really important question to ask. I know I'm the frustrating professor who doesn't give you the answer and is just kind of posing the question very often. But I think that's a valid question to ask. As I pointed out in the talk yesterday, if I were saying this in September year 2000, I might say something like, the Electoral College, it's not that big of a deal, because we've only had 3 elections where the popular vote did not align with the Electoral College outcome. And that's 1824, 1876, and 1888. No one remembers any of those elections. Almost every election, the popular vote has aligned with the outcome of the Electoral College. So what's the problem? We don't need to worry about it. That's probably something like I would have said in September year 2000. In November 2000, Bush-Gore, presidential debate. The winner of the popular vote did not win the outcome of the Electoral College. The Republican candidate for president over the last 35 years only once has won the popular vote in the Electoral College. And that's a real problem for our democracy, I would argue. Not just a problem for the Republican Party. It's a problem because we want political competition. Political competition is absolutely necessary to a democracy. And we have a real crisis within the Republican Party when it comes to national candidates for office, the presidency, right? Where it's looks increasingly unlikely that a Republican candidate is going to win the popular vote. The popular vote was won by Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes in 2016? And then by almost 8 million votes by Joe Biden in 2020. And it looks like that gap might grow larger, right? And yes, I know that the Republican Party is working very strategically to game the Electoral College, as the Democrats are too. You got to play with what you got, and you got to play the Electoral College game, and that means focusing on those swing states, right? Because it's winner take all in all the states except for Nebraska. And so you got to focus on those swing states, and you got to pour money into it. Right now, currently, for the Republican Party, it's all about Pennsylvania, from their perspective. They lose Pennsylvania, all the pathways to Kamala Harris winning open up everywhere. I mean, Kamala Harris could lose Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona and Nevada, and if she wins Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, she wins the Electoral College by exactly 270 votes, 270 electoral votes. And so for Republicans, they're pouring everything into Pennsylvania. Is that the kind of democracy we want? I'm not so sure. I mean, and maybe it's not a popular vote. Maybe it's something like following the Maine and Nebraska model, which I pointed out last night. Be an interesting middle ground, maybe. Maybe we should all go in the Nebraska-Maine model. If you're not familiar with that, Nebraska and Maine give the winner of the statewide election the 2 electoral votes that come from the Senate congressional delegation. But then the other electoral votes are broken up by House district. You got to win that district to win that electoral vote. That's why Joe Biden won the District of Omaha, Nebraska. That's why Donald Trump won the 1st district in Maine, the most northern district in Maine. What if every single state divided electoral votes? Not all. Like, you win the statewide election, you get 2 electoral votes. But then the other electoral votes for the states, you got to win that district. What would that look like? It would probably look like candidates traveling to places they don't travel to today. Probably open up the campaign map a lot more. And it would mean that there would be presidential candidates in very interesting, unusual places, maybe even Kansas, right? It'd be a competitive Kansas House district race. With the District 2, would that be? Sharice David's district, Kansas. Is that District 3? So, I mean, that would be a competitive district. There would be talk about a Democratic candidate visiting Johnson County, Overland Park, and it wouldn't, shock people if that were the case. So I do think that we need to have more conversations about this. And also, just to add one other thing very quickly, the Electoral College is now politicized and polarized in ways that it never was in American history. It used to be kind of like an academic debate. Is the Electoral College a good way to select a president? Should we go to a popular vote? And it was like, kind of equal conservatives and progressives, if you will, and people in the middle would have different arguments about that. And there was no partisan lean to it. But today, if you really hate the Electoral College, the likelihood of you being a Democrat is probably pretty high. And if you're defending the Electoral College, the likelihood of you being a Republican is probably pretty high. In other words, it's like a partisan issue. And I think that itself is not good. I just think that our structural arrangements of power should not be partisan. We need to be careful about those things. Our elections and everything else. Yes, we should be partisan about issues, policy issues, abortion, gun control, and healthcare and education and other things, but the structures of our government, we should be worried about that.
Well, okay, here's an argument against that.
Yeah.
Because those very structures really create an unjust situation. There's no way you can think it's just to say that Wyoming gets 2 electoral votes for their 2 senators. First of all, they get the advantage of 2 senators. California has 2 senators.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 person, 1 vote. No, not even close.
Yeah.
The disproportional representation of the small states is outrageously unjust.
A Wyoming voter has 10 times the amount of power as a California voter.
Right, yeah. And that's just, I mean, I don't see anybody around saying that's unfair. That's
Yeah.
unjust. And it flies in the face of us considering ourselves an actual democracy
Yeah.
to have something like that. It's a vestige of a system that was unfair as its founding, and the only justification that anyone gives for it is actually a political one.
Yeah.
The very reason why Republicans are fine with that is only because the small states vote Republican. If that changed, then you'd see things getting less polarized
That's a good
politically.
point.
Because, like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a strong argument. And your argument rests on the question of fairness, right? And I think that fairness is a really important standard that we need to be thinking about when we have conversations about politics. What is fair and what is not fair? Partly because I've always liked having conversations that center on fairness, because fairness is not to the monopoly or advantage of one political party over another, or one ideology over another. There are conceptions of fairness that might be even radically different from one another, that have valid premises from which that we can have a conversation and deliberate and even argue about things, about what is right and what is just. So, yeah, it's an excellent point.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today to our first Times Talk of the year. We hope to see you join us on our other ones coming up. So thank you. Another round of applause for today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.